She finally left him, but the nightmare was just beginning, and what happened next will break your heart. She left the next morning while he was still asleep. No confrontation, no goodbye, just survival mode. And the moment she walked out that door, she probably thought the hardest part was finally over. She had no idea what was about to come next. She had been planning this for months. Every quiet moment stolen while he was in the shower or distracted by his phone, every careful step taken when she knew his attention was pointed somewhere other than her, every dollar she saved and tucked away somewhere he would never think to look was building toward one thing. Getting out. Not getting even. Not getting justice or an apology or a moment where he finally understood what he had done. Just getting out alive and intact, which is a sentence that should never have to describe a young woman's primary goal in life, and yet here we are. 7 months before this update, she posted on Reddit asking how to get her boyfriend to stop hurting her as a joke or an act of love. Those were the words she used. A joke. An act of love. Think about that for a second. She had been so thoroughly conditioned to frame physical pain as something that needed to be managed and navigated and worked around rather than escaped entirely, that she could not even name what was happening to her accurately. She was not asking how to leave. She was not asking whether she should leave. She was asking how to make it hurt less, how to help him stop doing the thing he was doing, as if the solution lived somewhere inside her own behavior. That is not a small thing. That is not a failure on her part or a reflection of her intelligence or her strength. That is what years of sustained psychological manipulation does to a person's internal world. It rewires how you understand what is normal, what is acceptable, and what you actually deserve, until you are asking strangers on the internet to help you adjust to something that should never have been happening in the first place. She mentioned in her original post that she had changed some identifying details out of fear of being recognized. But in this update, she shared something she had not been honest about before. She was actually a minor when she met this man. He was an adult. She was not. And that one detail reframes everything about this entire situation in the most gut-wrenching way possible. Let that sink in for a moment. Because everything that followed, the control, the monitoring, the escalating violence, all of it, began when she was not even old enough to fully understand what was happening to her. She did not walk into this relationship as an equal with life experience and emotional vocabulary and a developed sense of her own identity and what she deserved from the people around her. She walked into it as a child, with a child's enormous capacity for trust and a child's deep vulnerability to someone older who was directing focused, deliberate, calculated attention her way. The early stages of the relationship had already shown her a version of this man that should have registered as alarming to anyone watching from a safe distance outside it. But when you're young, and someone who is older and more confident and more certain of themselves is choosing you, specifically and deliberately choosing you out of everyone they could have pursued, and calling that feeling love, the warning signs do not arrive wearing warning signs. They come dressed as something else entirely. Wanting to know where you are at all hours can feel like he cannot physically bear to be without you, because you mean that much to him. Asking detailed questions about who you were talking to can pass itself off as genuine curiosity, as someone who finds your life interesting and wants to be part of every corner of it. Pulling you gradually away from your friends can be framed as wanting you all to himself because you are that rare and that valuable to him. The language of control and the language of devotion can sound almost identical when you have not yet learned to listen for the difference, and when the person speaking is practiced at blending them together. It takes time, and often it takes pain, to understand the real distinction between someone who loves you openly and freely and someone who is slowly, carefully, deliberately constructing a situation where you belong entirely to them. And when you are a teenager experiencing serious romantic attention for the first time, without the accumulated experience to contextualize it, you do not always have the framework to recognize which story you have walked into. By the time she posted her original update, things had already begun to shift in a way she could feel in her body before she could articulate it clearly. She was pulling away, creating small distances, finding little moments of breathing room, and he could sense it happening. People like this always can, because they are attuned to control in a way that most of us are not, and any loosening of that grip registers immediately. That is when the behavior escalated, because losing control is the one thing someone like him cannot tolerate without responding. Arguments started happening over nothing at all, flaring up over a text message, a look, 5 minutes that she could not account for to his satisfaction. Accusations of cheating arrived with a fury and a certainty that had nothing to do with anything she had actually done. He went through her phone without hesitation, treating her private messages and photos and search history as something that belonged to him, as inventory he had the right to audit. He tried to monitor every conversation, every location, every movement, building a structure of surveillance around her that grew tighter the more she tried to breathe inside it. This is not the behavior of someone who loves you and is struggling with their own fear. This is the behavior of someone who sees you as an object in their possession and is panicking because they can feel that possession slipping. The moment that finally made her leave happened during one of those arguments. He slapped her across the face. Not a shove in a moment of chaos, not something she could minimize or slowly rationalize away as a one-time loss of control that would never happen again. A slap, deliberate and sharp and impossible to misread. And whatever part of her had still been trying to find a version of this story where things eventually got better, where the relationship transformed into what it had promised to be at the very beginning, went completely quiet after that. The next morning, while he was at work and the apartment was finally, briefly, mercifully still, she packed what she could carry without taking too long and she left. She did not leave a note explaining herself. She did not wake him to have a conversation. She did not explain herself to someone who had demonstrated repeatedly that he did not see her as a person who deserved explanation or consideration. And the fact that she was able to execute that plan with that kind of cold, focused clarity, just hours after experiencing something that would send most people into shock, shows a depth of inner strength that she almost certainly does not give herself credit for, because people in survival mode rarely do. But walking out the door was not the end of it. Not even close. He started calling. Repeatedly and obsessively and at every hour, her phone lighting up again and again until she blocked the number, and then lighting up again from numbers she did not recognize. Then messaging across every platform he could reach her on. Then emailing. Then creating fake accounts and new profiles to reach her from angles she had already tried to seal off, finding side doors into her life that she had not even known to close. And then he showed up in person. At her workplace, where she was just trying to hold herself together enough to get through a shift without falling apart. At her school, a place that should have been a space where she could exist without looking over her shoulder every few minutes. He was not going to allow her to simply disappear and begin again, and he communicated that with complete clarity through every channel he could still access. This is the part of these stories that people do not always talk about enough. The leaving is terrifying and it costs everything a person has to walk out that door. But what comes after can be just as dangerous, and in many cases more so. The period immediately following a separation from someone with this kind of psychology is statistically one of the most dangerous windows for someone escaping abuse. The abuser has lost control, which is the single thing their entire sense of self has been built around protecting. They are not operating from reason in those moments. They are not calculating what consequences their actions might carry. They are following desperation in its rawest form, and desperation inside someone who has already demonstrated a willingness to cause physical harm is not something to minimize or wait out. She went to the police. She gathered herself and she went, which alone took an enormous amount of courage, and she tried to do everything the right way, to work within the systems and the institutions that are supposed to exist precisely for situations like hers. She told them what had happened. She told them what he was doing. And she was told the evidence was not sufficient. Not enough to act on. I understand that legal systems require standards of proof and that officers are frequently working within constraints that limit their options even when they can see clearly what is in front of them. But I also want to hold space for how catastrophically that must have landed for her. She finally crossed the threshold. She finally said the words out loud to someone with institutional power, someone who was supposed to be able to do something. She named what was happening and asked for protection. And she was sent home without it. That is a failure. Not hers. The system's. A failure that is neither rare nor accidental, and one that lands on people in her situation with a consistency that should be a source of serious collective shame. So she built her own safety from the pieces she had available, because no one else was going to construct it for her. She moved to a different city, leaving behind the routines and the places and the small familiar anchors of a life that had been hers. She changed her contact information completely. She blocked every pathway she could identify that he might use to find his way back to her. She essentially dismantled the entire infrastructure of her daily existence and began building a new one from scratch, in a place where he did not know to look, in a life he had no map to. And she is doing all of it mostly alone, still working through everything that happened, still feeling numb and hollowed out and profoundly exhausted on most days, but alive and out and upright and standing. The fact that she mentioned she was hoping to start therapy when she is able to tells you something important about exactly where she is right now. She is still in survival mode. She is not yet in the healing phase, not yet in the place where she can begin to carefully unpack what happened and understand its full dimensions. She is still just trying to stabilize, to establish the most basic foundation of safety and routine that has to exist before any deeper processing can happen. That is completely understandable. When you have spent years inside an environment like the one she described, an environment that began when she was a child and shaped her understanding of intimacy and care from the very beginning, your nervous system does not simply relax and reset because you changed your address and your phone number and moved to a new city. The body holds fear. It holds hypervigilance. It holds the memory of danger in ways that take real time and real support to slowly begin to untangle. Recovery from something like this is not linear and it is not quick and it does not follow a schedule that makes intuitive sense to anyone observing it from the outside. What I also want to say is that her honesty in this update carries a significance that she may not fully appreciate yet. It would have been simpler, and in some ways safer, to keep the detail about her age hidden. She had already hidden it once, and the reasons for that were completely understandable. Fear of judgment. Fear of how it might change the way her story was received. Fear of sitting with what it meant about how this all began. But she chose to include it in this update, and that required a specific and meaningful kind of courage. Because acknowledging that this started when she was a minor is not a neutral thing. It means looking back at your younger self with honesty and clarity and confronting the reality that you were not careless or foolish or in any way responsible for what was done to you. You were targeted by someone who was old enough to fully understand the power he had over a younger person and chose to use it deliberately, over a long period of time, in ways that shaped her at an age when people are still forming who they are going to become. Here is where I want to land on this. This young woman survived something that many people do not fully escape. She was targeted as a minor, patiently and deliberately manipulated over time into believing that control was love and that physical pain was a form of affection, and then had to carefully and quietly engineer her own escape from inside a situation that had become genuinely dangerous, without reliable support, without institutional protection, without someone arriving to make it easier. She did not have a dramatic breakthrough moment where the right person recognized what was happening and pulled her to safety. She saved herself. Slowly and quietly and methodically, one day and one carefully hidden dollar at a time, until she had just enough to move. The people who commented on her original post deserve credit too. She said their advice helped more than they probably realized. That is worth sitting with. That is a reminder that reaching out matters. That words from strangers who will never meet you and have no obligation whatsoever to show up for you can still be a genuine and important lifeline for someone who feels completely isolated inside a situation that has been engineered to make them feel alone. Sometimes the right comment at the right moment is the thing that helps someone finally believe, truly and fully believe, that they deserve better and that better is not just a fantasy. But I also want to be clear about something. This man did not just make mistakes. He targeted a minor. He escalated over time to physical violence. He stalked her across multiple platforms and appeared at her physical locations in person after she left. He did not lose his temper once in a moment of weakness and carry remorse for it. He showed you exactly who he is at every single stage of this story. And the only comfort I take from any of it is that she is out. She is rebuilding. And she had the clarity and the courage to tell her story so that maybe someone else reading it, someone sitting somewhere right now in a situation that feels permanent and inescapable, will recognize something familiar and choose themselves too. Trapped in a loveless marriage since high school, and she refuses to even consider a way out. 10:48 p.m. He has been married since he was a teenager to someone he barely knew, living a life that was designed by other people, and now he is staring at a wall with no door in it. His wife will not consider divorce. His family is not on his side. And the two kids caught in the middle of all of this have no idea what is actually happening around them. This is one of those situations where the more you look at it, the worse it gets. Let us start from the very beginning, because the beginning of this story is actually the most important part of understanding everything that comes after. He was a high school student who had expressed doubts about his religion. Not loudly. Not defiantly. Just honestly, the way a young person does when they are starting to think for themselves and the world they were handed no longer quite fits the shape of who they are becoming. His parents heard that, and their response was not to support him or give him space to figure things out. Their response was to arrange a marriage with a girl from the same church, someone whose belief was absolute and enthusiastic, as though marrying her would somehow anchor him to a faith he was already drifting from. That is not love. That is a transaction. He was being tied down to a life before he was old enough to have chosen any part of it for himself. Before he had ever lived alone, paid a bill, had his heart broken, or figured out what kind of person he actually wanted to become. His wife was more excited than he was on their wedding day. He found that strange even then, standing at the front of a ceremony that felt like it was happening to him rather than being chosen by him. But the pressure around him was immense and suffocating in the way only communal pressure can be. When your entire community, your family, your social circle, and your identity are all wrapped up in a single institution, the cost of resistance is enormous. You are not just saying no to a wedding. You are potentially saying goodbye to every relationship you have ever known. You are risking becoming a stranger in the place that raised you. For a teenager, that kind of pressure is almost impossible to push through without extraordinary support, which he clearly did not have. So he stood there. He said the words. He went home a husband before he had ever really been allowed to be himself. Once they were married, the fault lines showed up immediately. She was deeply invested in the church and he was not. He stopped attending a couple of years in, quietly and without drama, simply unable to keep performing a belief he did not hold. And instead of that being accepted or worked through as a simple difference in conviction, it was weaponized. When they struggled with infertility, his lack of faith was held up as the reason. His family and her family both pointed at his absence from church as a spiritual failure that was causing a physical consequence. Sit with that for a moment. Imagine grieving something as intimate and devastating as infertility and being told in the same breath that your doubts are the cause. That is an incredibly damaging dynamic. You are essentially being told that your authentic self is the reason for your shared suffering. And if you internalize that even a little, it makes leaving feel like an act of selfishness rather than self-preservation. It makes staying feel like penance you owe. They did eventually have 2 kids. And having children together, rather than strengthening the relationship, acted as a spotlight on everything that was already broken. He described it plainly. They never loved each other. They were never similar. Their beliefs are on opposite ends of the spectrum. He cooks. He does the hands-on parenting. He wears the baby and stays up through the sick nights, rocking a feverish child in a dark hallway while the house is quiet and the weight of his life settles on him like something physical. And rather than being appreciated for showing up as a fully engaged parent, He is accused of undermining gender roles and confusing their children by refusing to perform a version of fatherhood that he does not believe in. That is genuinely painful to sit with. Because he is doing everything right by his kids. He is present. He is nurturing. He is involved in the texture of their daily lives in a way that many parents never are. And the person who should be his partner is framing his involvement as a problem. She is not upset because he is a bad father. She is upset because he is not the kind of father that fits the framework she was raised to expect. There is a fundamental difference between those two things, and it matters enormously. One is a failure of character. The other is a refusal to perform a role he was never suited for. The situation with their children is actually where the stakes feel the highest in this story. He said clearly that he believes staying together would destroy their kids. That is not a small statement. That is not frustration talking. That is a father who has looked carefully at the environment he is raising his children in and recognized with terrible clarity that the conflict, the misalignment, and the low hum of hostility between their parents is doing active damage every single day. Kids are perceptive in ways adults underestimate. They absorb the tension in a household even when they cannot name it. They notice the clipped tones and the silences and the way two people avoid each other in a shared space. They learn what relationships look like from watching the one closest to them. And what these kids are watching is not a good model for anything. His wife refuses divorce and will only engage with religious-based counseling. That specific combination is significant and worth examining carefully. It is not just that she disagrees with divorce as an option. It is that the only form of help she accepts is one that exists within the framework that created this problem in the first place. Religious counseling in this context would almost certainly reinforce the same expectations and roles that are already crushing him. It would affirm her position and pathologize his. It would not be a path forward. It would be a path back to compliance dressed up as healing. And then there is his family and hers, who pushed them together as teenagers and have shown no signs of recognizing the damage that decision has caused. No accountability. No apology. No quiet acknowledgement that what they set in motion was not fair to either of these two young people. He says he is as done with his family as he can be. That line carries a lot of weight. Reaching a point where you have accepted that the people who were supposed to protect you are not going to help you now is a grief all on its own. It sits differently than other losses. It is slower and heavier, and it does not really go away. He is also genuinely afraid of being alone. He acknowledges that directly and without flinching from it. If he pursues divorce, his community will likely turn on him, his family will not stand by him, and he will be navigating a bitter and drawn-out legal process without much of a support system behind him. That fear is legitimate. It is not weakness. It is a clear-eyed assessment of what his life will actually look like on the other side of a decision that his entire world has defined as a moral failure. He is not being irrational. He is being honest about the cost. So here is what I think. He has not missed anything. There is no angle he has not considered, no conversation he has not already had in his head 100 times. He knows what this is. He has known for a long time. The question was never whether the marriage was broken. The question was always whether he had the support and the resources to survive what comes after admitting it. The honest truth is that staying in this marriage for the sake of keeping the peace is not protecting his kids. It is teaching them. It is teaching them what a marriage looks like. It is teaching them how people treat each other when they are trapped together and resentful and exhausted. Whatever short-term disruption a divorce causes, it is almost certainly less damaging than the long-term lesson of watching two people make each other miserable for the next decade. He deserves to be a person, not just a function. He deserves to be a father on his own terms, to raise his kids in a household that is not defined by hostility and control and imposed belief. He was handed a life he never agreed to at an age when he had no real power to refuse it, and he has spent over a decade trying to make it work anyway. At some point, continuing to sacrifice yourself does not become noble. It just becomes prolonged damage. He already knows what he needs to do. He just needed someone to say out loud that it is allowed. If you want to tell me which story hit harder, drop it in the comments. And if you made it this far, a like and subscribe would mean a lot.